Hello, Rick here, looking at episode 5 of Star Trek Discovery, Choose Your Pain. So, quickly, overall, I thought that this episode hit somewhere in the middle. It was alright. Whereas the previous episodes of Star Trek Discovery have had me veering between fanboy love and complete and total contempt, and that sort of equals out somewhere in the middle, this episode genuinely was, for me at least, sat fairly neutral. We get some new characters, some character development, some tardigrade torture, and an interrogation scene involving lights. So we start off with sort of a dream sequence floating through the corridors of the Discovery before it settles on the engineering lab and on Burnham, who then sees herself in the spore chamber where the tardigrade was being kept. I'm guessing this is all done to further mirror the whole misunderstood monster aspects of her personality and what she sees in the tardigrade. And now the fact that she's aware that the jumps are indeed causing it intense pain. So she summons a consultation, and Dr. Culber agrees to look into it to see if there's actually any physical damage being caused to the tardigrade by the jumps. Also, it has a little dog bowl now. So then we cut to a starbase where a group of Admiralty board members are meeting with Captain Lorca to discuss the recent discoveries made by, the Discovery. We learn it's been 3 weeks since the last episode, and the Discovery itself has made significant contributions to the war effort by being able to teleport in and out before the Klingons can react, just as Lorca planned. He's having a whale of a time, I think. He's able to conduct an effective one-man war against the Klingon army. Now, it's also mentioned that Stamets' research has effectively gone public and is being studied by other Federation researchers in hopes of replicating the spore jump technology. This seems to throw some water onto the fire of the theory that it might be a Section 31 ship. I don't see Section 31 so publicly releasing any sort of information if it was within their control, although they are there to protect the Federation, so maybe they would, maybe not. Anyway, moving on. We also see that Lorca has been given quite a great deal of power and freedom when it comes to conducting the Discovery's business, before we cut back to a scene of Tilly having lunch with Burnham. That's really about it. Then we cut back to the Admiralty board. Lorca's medicating his eyes just to remind us that he's got this photosensitivity, when the Admiral walks in on him and turns the lights on immediately. Unpleasant for him, to say the least. When she asks why he never got his eyes fixed, he makes an excuse saying he doesn't like doctors. She seems to take this personally, or potentially, so it's nice to see that someone that's worked their way up to Admiralty level through a medical field. She also quizzes him on why he recruited Burnham. And this is quite an interesting quote that I think gets played on again later when she asks, do you need to give people another reason to judge you? Foreshadowing some character development we get later on. On the way back to the Discovery, his shuttle gets ambushed by a Klingon D7? Anyway, tractor beam locks on, they get bored into the hangar and boarded. Unknown crewman is unknown and dies, while Lorca is taken prisoner. Meanwhile, back on the Discovery, the Admiralty contacts Lieutenant Commander Saru and informs him that he's now acting captain. So naturally, he begins formulating a plan in order to rescue their captain, involving the Discovery jumping in and jumping out in its usual hit-and-run tactics. Now, a wrench gets thrown into the works here, though, when, of course, Burnham comes to the bridge and tells Saru that the tardigrade is in fact potentially being damaged by the repeated jumps in its use as navigation. Now, he's put in quite a predicament here because they need it to rescue the captain, because of course he knows everything about the Discovery and its clandestine research. They can't afford to let him fall into the Klingons' hands, so they need to get him out. On the other side of things, you do have the ethical dilemma of you are effectively causing pain to this creature in order to use its abilities. This reminds me of the Star Trek Voyager episode Equinox, but in fact we're actually seeing the dilemma that would have taken place beforehand, before the crew of the Voyager would have found them. Ultimately, Saru says, strap the tardigrade in, we're going to need it. He then makes a bit of a fan-servicey requisitions to the computer to list some of the Starfleet's most decorated captains, because he wants to compare his performance to that of decorated heroes. It's nice to see some references to the old and current captains of the USS Enterprise, though I am curious that Garth's not on there, although presumably this is because he hasn't made his name famous yet, because it was the Klingon War that eventually forged his reputation. Perhaps this is too close to Axanar. Moving on. Lorca wakes up in his cell after being prodded by Harry Mudd. Mudd's introduction is sort of just as whimsical as his introduction in TOS kind of was. He seems a bit more scruffy and worn, but then this is a galaxy at war, so We learn that the Klingons routinely walk into the cell, stating, "Choose your pain," making the other prisoners pick out someone that is then going to receive a beating. Naturally, Mudd valiantly steps forward and volunteers himself. No, I'm kidding. He points out the weakest guy in the cell and they beat him to death before dragging him out. Yeah, Mudd was always a bit of a scumbag. At best, he could be a sort of playful rascal, but at worst, yeah, he's a roguish type. So, armed with Colbert's research and proof that the tardigrade is in fact physically being affected by the jumps in a negative way, she confronts Stamets in order to try and find a different solution for the jumps, something that won't distress the creature. I quite like how Stamets completely shuts down Burnham within 3 seconds. She thinks she knows how to manipulate people, she thinks she understands emotions and how things work. So she approaches him appealing to his ego, but within seconds he's just like, "What are you trying to do? What do you want?" I think this happens a couple of times in this episode. It's like Michael Burnham's being not exactly put in her place, but being surrounded by Starfleet. Again, it's like she's reverting back to her old personality somewhat, but that's not quite going to cut it here with this crew. I think we're going to have to see her personality change and adapt and become more human and less Vulcan as the series goes on. So, back to Lorca's cell, we find Tyler, I believe his name is, has been imprisoned as well. He's from a completely different ship. Lorca also drops a hint about how his ship can ghost in and ghost out without being captured. Didn't think much of it at the time, but this was actually a plot point that came up later. Meanwhile, back on the Discovery, Stamets is actually explaining how the spore drive works in detail. I had my own vague pseudoscience ideas on this involving energies and quantum entanglement and so on and blah-de-blah-de-blah, but basically it literally is a fungus that exists both in our dimension and in subspace. It exists across all of the known galaxy, and the tardigrade can actually input some of the fungal DNA into its own structure, thus allowing it to navigate in the same way that the spores sort of drift in and out of our reality. So yeah, quantum mushrooms. Also, is this Star Trek's first F-bomb? I think it is. So Lorca's being tortured by the captain of this D7 battleship, who it turns out is L'Rell, so in the last 3 weeks she's ascended to captaincy of her own vessel somehow. I'd be curious to see what the story is there. And I knew this would get brought up at some stage ever since it was first introduced in episode 1, but they use his aversion to light to torture him. Though this time there are only 3 lights. Meanwhile, the Discovery is all set to make its attempted rescue because they've worked out roughly where the D7 was going to be. But before they can jump, they discover that Stamets has taken the entire drive offline. It seems he shares Burnham's Federation values and can't just bring himself to torture the creature any further. He's created a solution that has the tardigrade's DNA in a metamorphosizing solution, and they could inject it into another organic being that's of sufficient complexity, and use that to power the device instead, the idea being to have a volunteer do it. Of course, as Saru points out, this is genetic augmentation, which is illegal in the Federation Charter. So they ask for more time to continue trying to find a solution. Saru turns up to try and work out what the hell is going on and why they can't jump, and Burnham effectively accuses him of being cowardly. He pulls rank in a very convincing fashion, tells them to strap the tardigrade in, because they have their captain to rescue. Back in the cells, we learn that Mudd is actually being acting as an informant for L'Rell by spying on them. What tipped Lorca off was the fact that L'Rell used the same term to describe the Discovery's rescue attempt about it ghosting in and ghosting out, appearing and disappearing. Now L'Rell's house, House Mokai, are renowned among the Klingons for being a house of deceivers and liars. I don't know if this is because they're like the Klingon intelligence service, if the Klingon Defence Force has such a service. But either way, these duplicitous tactics seem to be right up her street, even though they're not considered to be very, well, Klingon. Harry Mudd himself also has a rather bland view of the Federation. As he says, he used to run a business before their war started and he was completely ruined. So in his eyes, he's a victim from both the Klingon and the Federation. He's on his own side. So they nipple clap the tardigrade in and they jump. The special effects of Star Trek Discovery, especially the shots of the ships, still look great in my opinion. But the tardigrade seems to disagree. It shrivels up and goes into a sort of hibernation state by ejecting all of its water. So now they're stuck deep in enemy territory with no way to instantaneously jump out. Saru is painted as being perhaps slightly unfeeling and cold here, as he demands that they rehydrated and whack it back in the machine so they can escape. But in all honesty, what other choice do they have? Calvert assures Saru it's not as simple as that, because the organism would probably die. Stamets seems to acquiesce to Saru and disappears. The look he and Calvert share as he leaves the bridge though, you just knew he was going to be up to something. Meanwhile, back in the cells, the Klingons pop in to give them their daily dose of choose your pain, but the two Federation officers flip the tables. They leave Harry Mudd in the cell, take the Klingons' disruptors, and break out. Now on the way out, Lorca has to leave Ash Tyler alone for a couple of minutes, and I toyed with the idea of him being left there permanently, but it didn't seem to fit. After all, we did get some of Lorca's backstory. We learn of what afflicted his eyes to begin with. It was the fact that his old ship and his old crew were almost captured by the Klingons, and he destroyed his own vessel to prevent their capture and being dragged back to Kronos. The resulting explosion is what damaged his retinas. On the way out, L'Rell catches up to Tyler, and the two end up in a scuffle, but Lorca steps in at the last minute and shoots the bulkhead next to her, which then explodes and burns her side of the face. The two manage to make their way to small Klingon vessels called Raiders, which I don't like the design of, they look like peacocks, and they escape with more small Raiders in pursuit. I do like the line that Lorca gives about how we all choose our own pain. It's the reason he hasn't had his eyes fixed is because he uses it to remember his first crew, his first mistakes. This is probably what the Admiralty was referring to earlier, when she was saying, do you really need to give other people more reason to judge you? But what I think's interesting about Lorca's character is that though I use the word mistakes, I don't think he would see it as a mistake. He sees it as war, his duty. It's his conviction. What other choice would he have had? If he were to have to do it again, I think he probably would. Now fortunately the Discovery is not too far away at this point, and they see the incoming raiders. Now it's Saru here that notices, because of his understanding of the predatory mindset, that the first raider is in fact being pursued by the others, and they don't open fire. They manage to beam the captain and the new officer off, and then they jump out of there. Awesome. And +1 for recurring crewmen. However, Stamets isn't answering the comm. They rush down to the lab to find that he's injected himself with the mutagen and performed the jump using himself as the navigator. This is nuts, because from my point of view he's probably seen the entire mycelium network, and sure enough when he comes to, he's laughing hysterically about the whole experience. Probably elation that it worked, coupled with what he's just seen. This is the culmination of his life's research. He was literally plugged into the device that's allowing him to traverse the universe in seconds. It's bound to have lasting consequences. So, wrapping up the episode now, Saru confronts Burnham in the quarters about their disagreements from earlier, and they actually have a bit of reconciliation between the two. She passes on the telescope to him, and he admits that he is frustrated with the fact that she effectively ruined his career by getting Georgiou killed and him reassigned. She does console him by saying that he actually did a pretty good job as acting captain, and to be honest I tend to agree. His final command to her as acting captain is to basically set the tardigrade free. So say goodbye to Ripper, they sprinkle him in spores and jettison him out the airlock. Off into space. The poor abused little bugger unfurls after being free, and we get to see him travel by summoning sort of the electricity effect. Fortunately he doesn't go all flippity floppity and spinny like the Discovery does, and then he vanishes, flying off into the cosmos, presumably to get a drink. I think there's going to be repercussions for this as well. As mentioned earlier, Starfleet's having a tough time finding replacements, and now they've got rid of what is effectively the core components of their spore drive. Still, we go back to Stamets' quarters where we find out, confirmation, he is actually in a relationship with Dr. Colbert. Now, touchy subject here I guess, but I do like how this relationship was portrayed. Or in fact, not actually portrayed, because it wasn't relevant. For the characters, it didn't matter until now, because something is up with Stamets. We see at the end of the show that when he leaves the mirror, his reflection remains. Ooh, something's not quite right here. Now, I've got no idea if this is literally some sort of quantum reflection or some after image that's being left behind, or whether it's just stylistic license to indicate that something's up with him. But yeah, something's definitely awry. And now their relationship's been brought to the forefront because who's the first person that's going to notice it? The Chief Medical Officer, who is also the person closest to Stamets in his personal life. So this is probably what I'm looking forward to the most, and the speculation is going to be rampant for this one. But what do you think the actual reflection is? Do you think it's actually there? Do you think it's just hinting that there's a problem? What do you think is up with Stamets? Do you reckon it's going to have anything to do with this Mirror Universe episode that's coming up? I mean, it's clearly because he dosed himself up with water bear DNA. What's the extent of this mutagenic properties? Is it just that he can perceive the mycelium network now, or do you reckon if you scare him suddenly and go boo, he'll shed all his water and shrivel up like a prune? I'm actually eager to see what happens in future episodes of Discovery, so let me know what your predictions are going to be. And as usual, I've been Rick on Certifiably Ingame. Thanks for watching, and of course there'll be another one next week. Until then, thank you again, and goodbye. Of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most watery,